So I'm delighted to be joined by Will Whitehorn, who is the president of UKSpace, which is a trade association representing the UK space industry. So the first question is, obviously we're doing this one day after the budget. There were some announcements which impact on the space agency in the budget, a lot of new money for kind of innovative technology, including the space sector. What's your reaction to that?
I think if you look at the industry itself and academia in Britain, we are just amazed at the amount of money the government is prepared to pledge for innovation across science,
Yeah.
all of which will feed into space.
Yeah.
Space is not just about putting somebody on the moon or sending satellites up. Space is about a whole range of activities which are fed by things like artificial intelligence, the new quantum technologies of quantum physics being used in computing. You apply those and you make them into small little boxes, and you can build now satellites which are capable of doing amazing things to help this planet survive over the next 100 years.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that people don't really understand about space is just how crucial it is to our survival now. When I was born, the population of the world was 3 billion. It's now 7.8 billion, probably really 8 billion.
Yeah.
And it's going to be 10 billion, and I'll still be alive most likely. And 10 billion was always regarded as the maximum load that you could ever put on the planet Earth, because the planet Earth is a sealed petri dish. There's a very famous professor back in the 70s called James Lovelock, Professor James Lovelock, who developed Gaia theory, which is now largely accepted by science. Therefore, if we're going to survive with 10 billion people on the planet, it's no longer about space being something out there to do, something that's partly science fiction. Something's about getting to the moon or getting to Mars. Space is now crucial to our survival with this heavy population load. We need to industrialise in space. And Britain is in a position that it could actually be part of that story in a major way. Yeah. We are, without any doubt now, one of the countries with the most developed industry to build satellites. We're building something like 35 to 40% of the world's commercial satellites here in the UK. I'm on the board of a company called AAC Clydespace in Glasgow. We build little CubeSats. There's another company down in the south of England called Surrey Satellites. They build on the whole slightly larger but small satellites. We build very big satellites. People like Astrium, who are part of Airbus. Thales, the big European company, they have a base here building space equipment. Our universities, with their commercial arms, build most of the best instruments used on the missions that people get excited about, going to Mars or going to the moon. And they tend to build instruments that, on the whole, with one or two exceptions, work very well. Now, you add on to that the expertise that Britain has been building up in artificial intelligence and quantum technologies, and this fill up yesterday at a very difficult time for Britain, and a very difficult time because of Brexit, to know where the industry's going, has been a real shot in the arm. And the fact is, we are going to develop a national space strategy.
Yeah.
You know, and we are going to have a National Space Council that is going to meet, I believe, within the next few weeks at government level. And that will be, you know, ministers from different departments, from the MOD right across to BEIS and the Home Office, etc. And all of these different departments will finally have expertise being explained to them that they can use in space. And at the moment, it's not just about satellites, it's about moving to full-scale industrialization in space and having robots up there to build new satellites and to do things like develop drugs for the future. If you look at something like coronavirus, for example, and the way that in the future we could develop much more quickly ways to find molecules to deal with the on effects, like a new kind of antiviral drug, the place to do it is often in space, because you can combine molecules in zero gravity in a way that you can't do on the planet Earth. And also, if we look at the biggest, let's call it polluter, because I think that is a good word for it, as opposed to just carbon imprint and footprint. Server farms that we all rely on have now way overtaken aviation and human ground transportation as a source of carbon in the atmosphere. Because there are so many trillions of bits of data every day, including somebody watching this interview, that is a huge amount of electrons moving around the world. And for instance, you know, if you're a Google or an Amazon, in some cases you're using 50% of the electricity of a country like Ireland.
Yeah.
Or a proposal recently to use 10% of Luxembourg's electricity. And there are server farms all around China, Vietnam, the west coast of the United States, and they're eating oil and eating coal. And they're producing such huge amounts of carbon footprint that to keep them inside the planet Earth seems silly to me in the long term, when we know now we can put that technology in space.
Yeah.
And with encrypted quantum technologies, with a small train of, say, Clyde Space satellites or Surrey satellites, whoever satellite it is, made in the UK, we could provide most of the server capacity of the world from space. And space is incredibly cold, and they need incredible cold, really, and that's why some of them are going to Iceland now.
Yeah.
Server farms also need an awful lot of power. Well, it's limitless up there in space, because solar power is 100% efficient in space. And space is radioactive. And when you finish using the item, we can now have the technology to burn it up so as it leaves no debris, and it atomizes again.
I mean, do you think there are some people who kind of underestimate the size of the UK space industry because we haven't had that many astronauts and kind of big fancy projects?
Totally. The story of really what went for the UK space industry, what went right and wrong, strangely enough. I'm never a great believer that government should over-involve itself.
Yeah.
I see government as being a very good kickstarter for industries. And when it's a good kickstarter, it does things like provide innovation funding. It provides a basis, as the Americans are doing with NASA, which has now provided a basis of being the procurer of technologies from the new private sector, the new space companies like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin and such like. Yeah. These companies are being kickstarted by NASA by being given contracts to do work more efficiently in the private sector. That's government's role. But for a long time, government, even in Britain, kind of abdicated that role in the 70s and the early 80s. During our period of the great austerity of the Wilson and Callaghan governments, and the early period of Thatcherism, when there were other problems to sort out, the space industry kind of had to fend entirely for itself. This was a country, of course, that also had civil servants in the early 1970s who built one of the most fantastic small satellite launching rockets ever developed, called Black Arrow. And in 1970, they launched it with a small satellite called Prospero. And then a government paper was written by the civil servants saying, there'll never be a market for small satellites, so we're going to shut this whole project down. And that was a kind of body blow to the early space industry. And the British had been at the forefront of a lot of the technology in the space missions. Yeah. And they'd been at the forefront of actually, saving NASA's bacon a couple of times with the advanced radio astronomy that we had developed at places like Jodrell Bank and down in Australia at Woomera. And that almost could have been lost, but it wasn't. Yeah. What happened was we developed an industry without much help. And now government has understood what it's got. It's got a gem on its hands, not only an academic gem in very commercial, space-orientated departments in universities, but it's also got an industrial gem. And I think it is realising that it has to now help that kickstart into the major league, rather than being incredibly good players as suppliers. And suppliers of satellites. We can do launch here. It was difficult to do launch with old-style rocketry, but for instance, Virgin Orbit, which is the second Virgin space company, which has the 747 with the air-launched satellite launching vehicle, which bears a remarkable similarity to Black Arrow in some ways, with its tube that opens at the front to let the small satellite out, almost like a crocodile's mouth. That can come to Cornwall and can launch satellites from anywhere out over the Atlantic very safely. And we build the right kind of satellites for that. So I know that, for instance, the RAF are working on a project to bring Virgin Orbit to Cornwall. The government has put the money in before the last election to get Spaceport Cornwall underway. That's a good idea. Not only that, in Scotland, there are a couple of sites which are kind of almost fighting now to see who's going to be the one to be the basically the vertical launch site. And there's a company called Sky Aurora in Edinburgh who've already built a rocket capable of launching small CubeSats into space and are going to begin testing it soon. Lockheed Martin want to bring their small satellite launch rocket to Scotland. We could have real launch capability, and that matters for reasons of commerciality, the industrialization of space, and also for national security. I think the ability to quickly launch satellites is the best way to defend our assets in space. I don't, being somebody who can build small satellites very quickly to do any purpose that's required, if it gets knocked out by somebody who doesn't want that data to be seen, then if you can get another one up in 24 hours, they're going to be hard pressed to beat that. That's a much more successful way than trying to defend the asset too directly.
I mean, one thing I've almost got the impression, so this is from an outsider, is that as with so many things with Britain, there's a debate as to how close we should be with Europe. And one of the big kind of questions is the European Space Agency. So my understanding is that the UK, the proportion of funding that comes from the UK is actually relatively low compared to France or Germany. And as a result, we get relatively few benefits. So I had a look at the ESA roster for astronauts before I came in, and the UK's obviously got one, Tim Peake.
Yes.
Whereas France has 5, Germany has 6.
Yeah.
So it suggests that. So should
Now,
we?
ESA.
ESA,
Yes,
sorry, yeah. I mean, should we intensify our efforts into ESA, or should we perhaps even withdraw and do our own thing? What's the kind of the maximising benefit?
I am never wedded to anything for organisational structural reasons, but I actually, and I've never had a very close working relationship myself in the stuff that I've done in the space industry with ESA.
Yeah.
But I have tried to take a cold, hard look, and I think we absolutely should be in ESA. But we should also forge links with NASA to a greater extent. But those who want us to withdraw from ESA, and there have been people who've said that, actually simply don't understand that it's very difficult for British companies to work in America because of things called ITAR rules. The Americans are protectionist about their space industry. They have CFIUS and ITAR rules, commercial foreign investment in the US, in a US entity, and the international trade and arms regulations basically mean that if you want to work in America, you have to set up a full operating company there. You have to follow these ITAR rules very closely. And that's fine, but NASA also can't really procure from British companies at the moment. So as part of a trade deal, I think Britain should become the bridge between ESA and the US. And that could be an incredibly important global role. ESA is actually a very good organisation. And Britain is about to get quite a lot more work from ESA, especially in the climate change arena. Companies like UKSpace, my own company, or Surrey Satellites, or some of these other companies like Astro, all of these companies in the UK have expertise that ESA needs. Doesn't want necessarily, but it needs. And ESA is not a European Union organisation. It's rather like CERN. Actually, Britain was quite involved in setting up ESA in the first place. And for the contribution we make, we get, I have really tried to get as kind of unpolitical a view of this as possible. We are definitely now getting more benefit than we're getting more bang for our buck from ESA.
I mean, it kind of links into that, but we talked also a lot about ESA and NASA, but obviously the private sector seems to be doing some of the most interesting stuff with space. And you mentioned, Amazon and Virgin. I mean, Dominic Cummings, for example, wrote a blog suggesting the UK build a moon base with, in combination with, which one did he go for?
I haven't seen that.
I've
seen one or two of his blogs, but not that one.
It was with Jeff Bezos and Amazon.
Yeah.
This was a long time before he was in government. I mean, that being the case, do you think the UK should also, or the UK space industry and the government should also try and link more with these big, kind of very innovative private sector companies?
I mean, Britain has already in this country a big private sector operation, if you want to call it that. Some of them from the old-fashioned prime manufacturing groups who have a great deal of expertise, like Airbus, and some of it in really very entrepreneurial small private companies. And I think that is an asset we have that is actually something the Americans don't quite have.
Okay.
Where a lot of the money in the United States has been going is into space launch vehicles.
Yeah.
In some of the cases, space launch vehicles you could bring to the UK. For instance, you could bring the SpaceX's smallest Falcon rocket to the UK, and we know that Virgin Orbit is now planning to come to the UK with its air launch system from Cornwall. These technologies, combined with our entrepreneurial expertise in building small, cheap, highly efficient satellites capable of doing one thing, are a bright future.
Yeah.
In the case of UKSpace, the company I'm involved with, we've just built a number of single-purpose almost satellites designed to do climate change work. They're cheap, easy to put up, and they do what they say on the packet. One of them looks for algal bloom, another one is basically looking for fires that start. With the new technology we can put into these very small satellites, ideally launched from these cheap vehicles such as Virgin Orbit, that is a world-beating skill. It's a competitive advantage. I mean, Adam Smith will be proud of UKSpace, since it comes from very near where he was born as a company, because it's capable of doing that things. Surrey Satellite's capable of doing this kind of stuff. Astrium, a whole range of companies in Britain perfectly capable of getting involved with the big giant companies in America who actually are not always that nimble. I mean, Elon has been extraordinarily lucky, and he came along, as has Virgin Galactic and Virgin Orbit and Jeff. They've come along at a time when there was an act that went through American Congress to basically commercialize space properly. It was called the Commercial Space Launch Amendment Act 2004, and I'm very closely wedded to it because I had to go in front of Congress with Elon Musk and a man called Burt Rutan to get it through Congress. And we got it through, and that has allowed us to develop new types of vehicles for human spaceflight and non-human spaceflight in the private sector, which are pretty efficient. And that's where the change has come. All the original rocketry was designed as a government monopoly, really with military use at its core during the Cold War, ICBMs in other words, to hurl nuclear missiles at each other. And they weren't designed for the purpose of efficient access to industrializing space. Yeah. This new generation of vehicles, which have had to grow up with the help of NASA contracts in America, which we've not had the benefit of in Britain. We haven't had a UK space agency being able to basically procure those kind of things in the same way. And my feeling is that what I want to see happening in the UK is that the UK Space Agency concentrates on what it's really good at, science, getting involved in missions, working with ESA and NASA, but also procuring equipment. And we are capable of providing that. And then the regulatory function of space launch should go with the way it's gone in America. In America, the FAA got responsibility. They have a special space administration with the Federal Aviation Authority, led by a great guy called George Niels, if he's still running it, who was put in to run it when I was over there in the States working on Virgin Galactic. And they've done a really good job of creating the right environment to get these experimental vehicles to commercial safety standards for the future. And I think the CAA should take that role in Britain, imminently, hopefully. And I believe, fingers crossed when it comes to government, I believe that will happen over the period of this year. And then the UK Space Agency can become much more like NASA. It doesn't have to worry about regulating us as private companies. It worries about its role with government in being an innovation centre for us. And I think that's where it would like to be as well. And the CAA is it's one of the best regulators Britain ever created. In fact, all the other ones around the world are modelled on it, which very few people realise.
I mean, the UK Space Agency has an objective, I believe, of taking 10% of the global space economy by 2030. Now, that sounds to me incredibly ambitious. Do you think that's achievable?
Yeah, I actually think the ambition is one that the UK space industry has, and the UK Space Agency is part of that with us. Yeah. And I think it is ambitious, but it's achievable. It wouldn't have been achievable in a world where we could only produce the hardware. But we in this country are now capable of doing things like the robotics. I believe that we will have server farms in space that displace the ones you now see on the ground, and they'll be built in space by robots where the artificial intelligence and the thinking behind how they work comes from this country. Yeah. I also believe that we are going to be able to launch a lot of these smaller type satellites from the UK. We couldn't do that in the past. Then we can create a viable space economy, which can also help maintain Britain's national security. Because if you're not in space, then you're not going to have any security in the future. Because people are going to be able to watch us in a way we can't watch them. Whereas what we all should be watching is the planet itself and trying to make it habitable for those 10 billion people in 30 years' time.
I mean, kind of on that point, obviously Trump in America has launched Space Force, a new arm of the US military. At the moment, I believe the UK space comes under the RAF. Do we need a kind of American-style system where we have a new service to protect our space assets?
Well, the MOD has a new 2-star seniority role for space that's just been created, which we at UKSpace are pleased about because it means that it's getting the kind of traction it needs. I think there will come a time when we will have a Royal Space Force in the future as well, not because I will call for it or because our industry will call for it, it's because it's logical. Yeah. If we're going to put billions and billions of pounds of assets into space, which secure the future of our country from the point of view of its communications, the safety of its inhabitants, and its industrial infrastructure, then we're going to have to defend those assets. And defending those assets might partly mean being able to launch new ones very quickly to keep our role up there if somebody's mucking around with them.
Yeah.
But there are going to be bad people in the future who will want to try and do damage to space assets. And we have to take account of that. So I do feel that a space force is coming in the future. But it's not something that we at UKSpace are particularly calling for, because there's an awful long way to go first. But it's something that, from the point of view of national security, the government itself is thinking pretty hard about, I think.
Now, I mean, we mentioned earlier about people thinking that the UK space industry is a lot smaller than it actually is because it hasn't kind of done those high-profile events. I mean, do you think there's a case where the UK space industry should try and do more high-profile events? I mean, is there kind of a case of putting a Union Jack on the moon? That kind of thing to grab public attention?
Having been the person who, sold the idea to a large extent of founding Virgin Galactic, I am not against the idea of high-profile events. But I want to do high-profile events which mean something for the future. I don't want to put a car in space. I would far rather put a satellite in space that solves a big problem very quickly.
Yeah.
Like, if we're worried about methane being produced from the sea, let's build a single-purpose, cheap satellite that can answer that question, which the satellites currently can't do. If the great satellites that NASA developed 30 years ago, which told us that the polar ice caps were melting, are about to end their life, and no one has got a solution to how we're going to carry on doing that work, well, let's Britain do it, because we could build them cheaply enough now to take over that role. But they'd only do that role. Yeah. But they'd be hundreds of thousands of pounds and a couple of million to launch. This is the sort of thing we should be doing. And yes, we should be taking people into space from Britain. Yeah. I don't see why Spaceport Cornwall can't. As well as carrying satellites with Virgin Orbit, why can't Virgin Galactic go there? It's going to be commercial by the end of this year, early next year. I was lucky enough to work on that project for some years of my life and get it going in the first place. And I have a ticket on a flight. Oh. Well, maybe my ticket could be from Cornwall.
I mean, do you think that's realistic within a few years? As in kind of, the early 2020s?
I'm thinking within 2 years.
Ah, nice.
I think we need to move quite quickly on this kind of stuff. I think we need to get everything up and running as fast as we can.
Yeah. I mean, say it's kind of on a related point. So there's also a plan to build one in Scotland as well, isn't there? But I mean, other than satellites and space tourism, what are the kind of the main commercial opportunities? I mean, I read things about asteroid mining and that kind of thing. Yeah. I never know how realistic
I think in the short term, the main commercial opportunities are secure data from space. The other main opportunity is exactly the one I mentioned earlier, server farms in space and taking that heat out of the planet, especially for the most secure transactions that need to be protected to the greatest extent, where you can really data encrypt with quantum technology in space and send data very efficiently. And banks and other organizations of that type would pay for that.
Okay.
And early provers that you can take heavily carbon-based activities outside the planet's atmosphere and do them in space. So I think the UK should be in the lead of developing robotic construction of vehicles up there. Yeah. We could do that on an experimental basis and be proving to the world that we're capable of doing it. I think we have to be very ambitious. One of the things that's let this country down at times in the past is wanting to be ambitious, coming up with all the great ideas, and then letting other people do them and us not doing them as well afterwards. I think in space we have the opportunity to not do that, to be a real spacefaring nation.
Yeah, I mean, in kind of most of the exploration of the past couple of hundred years, so the New World, etc., etc. I mean, Britain's been at the forefront. Whereas with space, it seems slightly more dubious. I mean, the Russian space program is vastly bigger than ours, and their economy is much smaller, which seems odd when you look at it. I mean, what do you think the government needs to do to kind of get to a position where the UK is, pulling its weight?
Again, you have to look back in history to answer that question. The problem was that in the late 1960s, what scared civil servants, just as Britain was developing this amazing rocket called Black Arrow that would have been great for launching small satellites, and the fledgling industry was thinking, what a good idea, it got the rug cut under it, because at the same time they were looking at the space program, and they were looking at people landing on the moon on Saturn V rockets, And along with the Vietnam War, it came very close to bankrupting the United States.
Yeah.
The great inflation of 1972-3, which happened and led partly to the oil crisis of 1973-4, was partly due to the fact that at one point during 1968, NASA's expenditure had reached 10% of the whole GDP of the United States.
Yeah.
And that scared people in government at a time when Britain was still coming out of really the long austerity of the 1950s, even into the 60s. And we'd cancelled exciting projects to develop groundbreaking aircraft like TSR-2. This fear, and I think, it was the nature of that government at the time. The Harold Wilson government was a government that bound itself up in fear. Although they'd said the words white heat of technology, they actually blew a great big gallon of water over the white heat and turned into dead metal. And I think that historical problem is the one that we're now overcoming. We can punch above our weight because the costs of getting to space are no longer the barrier. The barrier is not economic. The barrier now is going to be regulatory. We need to create a regulatory structure in the UK that wants people to come here. It's a well-regulated industry here, but it may be in some ways too regulated. And that's one of the things that giving that role to the CAA with the UK Space Agency and actually creating a structure saying, right, we want to do launches here.
Yeah.
And then the private sector will come and invest here. Because the one thing Britain is, it's a very safe place to invest. We're not beholden to anyone. We're an island. We do what we say. We respect property rights. And you can be pretty sure we're not going to be spying on you.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go to launch small satellites in some other parts of the world where we have been launching over the past 20 years, you can no longer trust that.
Yeah.
So for the kind of space investors of the type that I know, they are going to be happy to come here if they feel the conditions are right. And it's up to us in not only the industry, but also in government, and that's what we'll be talking to government about a lot over the next few months. It's up to us to create the environment that makes them want to come to us.
Okay.
We want to create the kind of, the build it and they will come Gordon Selfridge approach.
Yeah. I mean, just one final question. It's a bit cheeky, but if everything progresses well and the government supports the UK space industry, what could it look like in, say, 20 or 30 years' time?
The space industry in 20 or 30 years' time?
The UK space industry, yeah. If the government provides the kind of support you want.
I can imagine in 20 or 30 years' time, a small group of scientists going from Oxford University in their hover flivver down to Cornwall and getting on board a Virgin Galactic spaceship with their new experimental molecule that they think can cure all viruses, but they need 5 minutes of weightlessness to combine it. And the cheapest and easiest way, rather than using a robot, is to still use a human to do it and watch it happening. And they get on board and they're back by the evening and they're back at Oxford that night and they've done it. That's the kind of world we want to create. We want to create a world where I'm watching my iPad and I've got whatever it's called by then, the Z-Pad, and I'm watching the latest episode of Succession with the media empire of, Jeff Bezos being unbound in it, and I'm seeing it in perfect quality, and all of it's coming from space, and it's not using a eighth of carbon in the British atmosphere, because it's outside in that horrible radioactive world that all that stuff's happening. And the next day, we go in and a satellite is launched carrying a little robot that can go and repair the other one that's up there and start building the next generation solar power generators to microwave power down to the station which sits up in the Shetland Islands and distributes power all over Scotland. And there's another one in Cornwall distributing power all over the southeast from space. And we're not having to use beyond the resources we have. By that time, we'll have used up every ounce of wind availability that we have and every ounce of conventional solar in a place that's not ideal for it at any time but the middle of the summer. And we will have a world which basically is much cleaner than it is today, and the pressures of population are being assuaged by the fact that we can produce the necessities of survival outside the atmosphere.